না, না ম্যাম, একটুখানি। হ্যাঁ ম্যাম, স্টার্ট করুন।
নমস্কার, শুভ সন্ধ্যা। দীর্ঘ বিরতির পর একাডেমি অফ ফোকলোরের পক্ষ থেকে আজ সন্ধে আমরা আবার মিলিত হয়েছি আমাদের স্মারক বক্তৃতাগুলির জন্য। আমাদের একাডেমি অফ ফোকলোরের তত্ত্বাবধানে একটি 6 মাসের সার্টিফিকেট কোর্স পরিচালনা করা হচ্ছিল গত বছর থেকে, এবং সেই কোর্সটির ক্লাস, পরীক্ষা ইত্যাদিতে আমাদের সমস্ত মাননীয় সদস্যরা এত বেশি ব্যস্ত হয়ে পড়েছিলেন যে এই নিয়মিত যে কর্মসূচি, যেটা গত 2 বছর ধরে কোভিডের সময় থেকে চলছিল, সেটা কিছুদিনে বিরতি দিতে হয়েছিল। কিন্তু আবারও আমরা আজকে এসেছি আমাদের স্মারক বক্তৃতামালার দ্বিতীয় এই যে ফেজটা, এইটা শুরু করার জন্যে। আহ আজকে যার স্মরণে আমাদের এই স্মারক বক্তৃতামালার সূত্রপাত হচ্ছে, এবং এরপর পরপর প্রত্যেক সপ্তাহে একটি করে 6টি বক্তৃতা হবে। তিনি শুধুমাত্র পরিচিত লোক সংস্কৃতিবিদ ছিলেন তাই নয়, আমাদের কাছে আমাদের কাছে অর্থাৎ একাডেমি অফ ফোকলোরের মানুষজনের কাছে তার সব থেকে বড় পরিচয় যে তিনি একাডেমি অফ ফোকলোরের 1969 সালে যারা প্রতিষ্ঠা করেছিলেন, তাদের প্রতিষ্ঠাতাদের প্রথম নাম। তিনি হচ্ছেন ডক্টর দুলাল চৌধুরী। ডক্টর চৌধুরী বেশ কিছুদিন আগে প্রয়াত হয়েছেন, এবং দুর্ভাগ্যবশত সেই খবর আমরা খুব দেরিতে পেয়েছিলাম, এবং সেই খবরটি দেরিতে পাওয়ার কারণে তার স্মরণ অনুষ্ঠান করতেও আমাদের অনেকটাই দেরি হয়ে গেল। সেই স্মরণ অনুষ্ঠানের আজকেই সূত্রপাত। একটু কারিগরি সমস্যা হচ্ছে। আমাদের এই অনুষ্ঠানের একদম গোড়ায় যার মুখপাত করবার কথা ছিল, আমরা একটু চেষ্টা করছি তাকে আরেকবার আমাদের সঙ্গে যুক্ত করার জন্য। তাই জন্য আপনাদের থেকে আমরা জাস্ট 2 মিনিট সময় চেয়ে। আমি আমাদের সঞ্চালিকা মনীষাকে অনুরোধ করব প্রফেসর সেনগুপ্তকে যেন ও শোয়েতে যুক্ত করে দেয়। আমি মনীষাকে অনুরোধ করব প্রফেসর সেনগুপ্তকে যেন শোতে ও যুক্ত করে দেয়। মনীষা, যদি থাকো, একটু অনুরোধ করব আরেকবার স্ট্রিমইয়ার্ডে ঢুকে আমাদের প্রফেসর সেনগুপ্তকে একটুখানি যুক্ত করে দিতে, কারণ ওনাকে ব্যাকস্টেজ দেখাচ্ছে। একটু যদি ওনাকে শোয়ে যুক্ত করে দাও, তাহলে আমরা অনুষ্ঠানটা এগিয়ে নিয়ে যেতে পারি। আমরা দুঃখিত, এই যান্ত্রিক সমস্যার জন্য একটু অনুষ্ঠান সম্প্রচারটাতে একটু সমস্যা হচ্ছে। আপনাদের কাছে মার্জনা চেয়ে নিচ্ছি। আমরা এক্ষুনি বাকিটা আবার শুরু করছি। আমরা আপনাদের কাছে আরো একবার মার্জনা চেয়ে নিচ্ছি যে মাঝখানে অনেকটা সময়ের বিরতি আমাদের নিতে হলো এই কারিগরি সমস্যার কারণে। আমাদের মধ্যে আছেন অধ্যাপক পল্লব সেনগুপ্ত, যিনি একাডেমি অফ ফোকলোরের সেই প্রতিষ্ঠার সময় 1969 সাল থেকে রয়েছেন, এবং ডক্টর দুলাল চৌধুরীর অভিন্ন হৃদয় বন্ধু ডক্টর সেনগুপ্ত ছিলেন। তো আজকে আমরা তাকেই অনুরোধ করব প্রথমে ডক্টর চৌধুরী সম্পর্কে আমাদেরকে কিছু স্মৃতিচারণ করে শোনাতে, এবং তারপরে আমরা আমাদের পরবর্তী অনুষ্ঠানটায় চলে।
শুভ সন্ধ্যা। এই মুহূর্তটা আমার কাছে একই সঙ্গে আনন্দের এবং অনেকটা দুঃখেরও। আনন্দের এই কারণে যে আমার অতি ঘনিষ্ঠ বন্ধু ডক্টর দুলাল চৌধুরী, আমার কাছে যার পরিচয় ডাক ছিল ডিসি, তাকে নিয়ে একটা বক্তৃতামালার আয়োজন করছেন একাডেমির বর্তমান পরিচালকরা। দুঃখের এই জন্যে যে তিনি তোমার ছাত্র বয়সের বন্ধু, আজকে তার স্মরণে যে আলোচনা চক্র শুরু হলো, আমি সেখানে বসে আছি একা, এবং আমাদের সময়কার একাডেমির পরিচালনায় আমরা যারা ছিলাম আর কেউই নেই। সে পথে আমি একা নিঃসঙ্গ পথিক হয়ে বসে আছি। ডক্টর দুলাল চৌধুরী, দিব্যজ্যোতি মজুমদার, নির্মল দাস, এরকম কয়েকজন ছাত্র কলকাতা বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়ের বাংলা বিভাগে, দেবব্রত চক্রবর্তী, এরা কলকাতা বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়ের লোক সংস্কৃতি যখন একটা বিশেষ পত্র হিসেবে শুরু হলো ডক্টর আশুতোষ ভট্টাচার্যের নির্বন্ধে, সেই প্রথমবারের ছাত্র তারা, এবং আমি ঠিক ওদের আগের বছরের ছাত্র। আমাদের সময় লোক সংস্কৃতি ছিল না, কিন্তু ব্যক্তিগত বন্ধুত্বের খাতিরে লোক সংস্কৃতি বিষয়ে একটু একটু আগ্রহ আমার তখন থেকেই গড়ে উঠতে আরম্ভ করেছে। পরবর্তীকালে তখন আমরা সকলেই অধ্যাপনায় প্রায় যুক্ত, কেউ অন্য ধরনের কাজে যুক্ত। আমার লোক সংস্কৃতির দীক্ষা আমার যার কাছে, অরুণ কুমার রায়, আমি তার সঙ্গে একসঙ্গে চতুষ্কোণ পত্রিকার সম্পাদক মন্ডলীতে ছিলাম। উনি বিখ্যাত লোক সংস্কৃতিবিদ, বিশ্বখ্যাত পণ্ডিত প্রফেসর হাইন্স মোডের ছাত্র, এবং ওর সূত্রে প্রফেসর মোডের সঙ্গে আমাদেরও যোগাযোগ হয়েছিল বহুবার। ওর কাছাকাছি আস্তে আস্তে লোক সংস্কৃতির দিকে আমার একটা ওই ছাত্রবয়সের আগ্রহটা একটু বিকশিত হয়েছিল, এবং সেই বিকাশটাকে যিনি পরিপূর্ণ করে দিয়েছেন তিনি হচ্ছেন দুলাল। 1969 সালে যখন একাডেমি অফ ফোকলোর প্রতিষ্ঠা করেন দুলাল, দিব্যজ্যোতির কথা বলছিলাম, নির্মল, দেবব্রত, এরা ওরা শুরু করলেন, ওদের সঙ্গে এসে যোগ দিলেন রেবতী মোহন সরকার, দীনেন্দ্র কুমার সরকার, নির্মল চক্রবর্তী, সুনীল চক্রবর্তী প্রমুখ, ধীরেন্দ্রনাথ বাস্কে, এবং দুলাল আর দিব্যজ্যোতি আমাকে একবারে জোরজার করে একাডেমির কাজে যুক্ত করলেন। এবং ওই যে অভিমন্যুর মুখে আমি ঢুকলাম, তখন আমার 29 বছর বয়স, আর পরের 44 বছর তার থেকে আর বেরোতে পারলাম না। এই কারণে দুলালের কাছে আমি অত্যন্ত কৃতজ্ঞ। আমার প্রাথমিকভাবে লোক সংস্কৃতির শিক্ষাটা অরুণদার কাছে ঠিকই, কিন্তু হাতে কলমে ফিল্ড ওয়ার্কে কাজ করার অভিজ্ঞতাটা দুলাল, দিব্যজ্যোতি ওদের সঙ্গে গিয়ে হয়েছে। দুলালের সহধর্মী সাধনা, দিব্যজ্যোতির সহধর্মী তুলিকা, এরাও ছিলেন, এবং আমাদের একটা পরিবারের মতো হয়ে গিয়েছিল। দুলালের নেতৃত্বে আমরা নানা জায়গায় ক্ষেত্র সমীক্ষায় যেতাম, এবং বই পড়া বিদ্যের বাইরে ক্ষেত্র সমীক্ষায় না গেলেই সত্যি সত্যি লোক সংস্কৃতির অন্ধারে প্রবেশ করা যায় না, এটা দুলালের সাহচর্যে আমি এসে বলেছিলাম। দুলাল লোক সংস্কৃতি ডক্টরেট করলেন। দুলাল মধ্যবিত্ত ঘরের ছেলে, যথেষ্ট কঠিন অবস্থার মধ্যে দিয়েই একরকম নিজের জীবিকাকে বাজি রেখেই চলে গেলেন আমেরিকার ইন্ডিয়ানা বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়ে। সেখানে গিয়ে রিচার্ড এম জনসনের কাছে লোক সংস্কৃতি বিষয়ে তালিম নিলেন। দুলাল দেশে ফিরে এলেন, তারপরে একাডেমি অফ ফোকলোরের একটা পরিপূর্ণ বিকাশ শুরু করলেন দুলাল। নেতা তিনি, তার সহযোগী আমরা। শুধু একাডেমি অফ ফোকলোরই নয়, দুলাল এই সময় ইন্ডিয়ান ফোকলোর কংগ্রেসেরও একজন উদ্যোক্তা হয়ে উঠলেন। প্রফেসর জওহরলাল হান্ডু প্রমুখ অন্যান্য রাজ্যের যারা অগ্রগণ্য লোক সংস্কৃতিবিদ ছিলেন তারাও এলেন, এবং সবাই মিলে ওই 70-এর দশকে, 80-এর দশকে আমরা একটা নতুন করে লোক সংস্কৃতি আন্দোলন চালু করেছিলাম, এবং সেই আন্দোলনের নেতৃত্বে ছিলেন দুলাল। দুলাল ব্যক্তিগতভাবে অত্যন্ত সদালাপী মানুষ। দুলালের ছাত্রছাত্রীরা এখনো কেউ কেউ একাডেমিতে আছেন, মাধুরী আছেন, সর্বাণী আছেন, যারা একাডেমিতে নিয়মিত আসেন না তারাও দুলালের কথা বলবেন, তারা এখনো আমাদের সঙ্গে যোগাযোগ রেখেছেন, সুভাষ মিস্ত্রি প্রমুখ। এরা জানেন যে একই সঙ্গে সদাহাস্যময় একটি মানুষ, কখন তাকে কেউ রাগতে দেখেনি, কখনো কেউ তাকে বিরক্ত হতে দেখেনি, বরং সমস্ত রাগ এবং বিরক্তির উপলক্ষকে দূর করে দিয়ে অকাতরে নিজের সংসারের খরচ বাঁচিয়ে একাডেমির জন্য তিনি অর্থ বিনিয়োগ করতেন, এবং ওর উদ্দীপনায় অন্যদেরও করতাম আমরা। ফলে যেভাবেই হোক একাডেমিটাকে আমরা একটা আমাদের ঘরোয়া সম্পদ হিসেবে দেখেছিলাম, কিন্তু আমাদের ব্যক্তিগতভাবে কুক্ষিগত করে রাখেনি। এই কুক্ষিগত না করে রাখার তালিমটা কিন্তু দুলালই দিয়েছিলেন। দুলাল এরই পাশাপাশি অজস্র কাজ করে গেছেন। তার গবেষণাগুলো, বিশেষ করে চাকমা প্রবাদ সম্পর্কে তার যে বিশেষ গবেষণা, বা রবীন্দ্রনাথের লোক সংস্কৃতি চর্চা নিয়ে যে দুলালের কত নতুন দৃষ্টিভঙ্গির কাজ, এইগুলো উনি দেখেছেন। একটা কথা বলি এখানে, কলকাতা বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়ে একটা পেপার লোক সংস্কৃতি পড়ানো হতো ঠিকই, কিন্তু সেটা মূলত লোক সাহিত্য নির্ভরই। লোক সংস্কৃতির যে বিজ্ঞানসম্মত দিক, যার সূত্রে আজকে লোক সংস্কৃতি বিজ্ঞান বা ফোকলোরিস্টিক্স এই বিদ্যা শৃঙ্খলাটা গড়ে উঠেছে, সেটা কিন্তু একাডেমি অফ ফোকলোর থেকে শুরু হয়েছিল, এবং এদিকে দিশা দেখিয়েছেন আমাদের দুলারি। ওই যে উনি ইন্ডিয়ানায় ফোকলোর পড়ে এসছেন ডটসনের কাছ থেকে, আধুনিক লোক সংস্কৃতি বিজ্ঞানের দিশাটা কি সেটা আমরা চিনলাম। এর ফলে লোক সংস্কৃতির ছাত্র যারা ছিলেন তারা বস্তুতপক্ষে লোক সাহিত্য পড়তেন কলকাতা বিশ্ববিদ্যালয়ে, কিন্তু তার বাইরেও লোক সংস্কৃতি যার বিস্তীর্ণ ভুবন আছে, সেই ভুবনটাকে চেনানোর দিশারি ছিলেন দুলাল। এবং দুলালের নেতৃত্বে আমরা কাজটা করতে শুরু করলাম এবং একাডেমি অফ ফোকলোরের পুরো 800 নম্বরের একটা কোর্স দুলাল চালু করেছিল। আমরা সবাই মিলে এমন একটা কোর্স তৈরি করলাম, এমন একটা পাঠ্যক্রম তৈরি করলাম, যে পাঠ্যক্রমটা আমরা তো এখন একটু অহংকার করেই বলতে পারি সেই সময়ে ভারতবর্ষের কোথাও ওভাবে পড়ানো হয়নি। একাডেমির ছাত্র যারা ছিলেন তারা পরে কোনো কোনো সময় বিদেশে পড়তে গেছেন। সেই রকমই ছাত্রছাত্রীরা কেউ কেউ আবার যখন ঘুরে এসেছেন, ঘুরে এসে একাডেমিতে গেছেন এবং তারা এসে উচ্ছ্বসিত হয়ে বলেছেন যে ওখানে গিয়ে আমরা কোনো নতুন অ্যাসপেক্ট পাইনি, হয়তো আমাদের কাজ করার সুবিধাটা অনেক বেশি হয়েছে, কিন্তু এমন একটা নতুন বিষয়ে ওখানে আমাদের কেউ দেখাননি যে আমরা একাডেমিতে আপনাদের কাছে পড়ে যাই। এই যে বিস্তৃতিটা, ইংরেজি করে বললাম, যদি বলতাম এই মিলিউটার দিশা দুলাল দেখিয়েছিলেন আমাদের দেশের লোক সংস্কৃতি চর্চার ইতিহাসে। সেই জন্য এই নীরব নিরলস কর্মী দুলাল ডক্টর দুলাল চৌধুরী ডিসি, তার একটা বিরাট ভূমিকা আছে। সে ভূমিকাটা অস্বীকার করলে চলবে না। দুলাল শেষ জীবনে শারীরিক কারণে খুব অপটু হয়ে পড়েছেন, গৃহবন্দী হয়ে পড়েছিলেন। খুব নিয়মিত ভাবে যে যোগাযোগ হতো তা নয়, কিন্তু তা সত্ত্বেও দুলালের সঙ্গে আমাদের একটা আত্মিক যোগাযোগ ছিল। মাঝে মাঝে যোগাযোগ গিয়েও হয়তো হয়েছে, কিন্তু শেষের দিকে উনি টেলিফোনে ধরতে পারতেন না। ওর স্ত্রী মারা গিয়েছিলেন, একটি মেয়ে মারা গেছিল, আর এক মেয়ে বিদেশে থাকে। ফলে বস্তুত এখানে উনি পারিবারিক হয়ে মানে নিঃসঙ্গ একা হয়েছিলেন। কিন্তু তবুও তার যে লোক সংস্কৃতি সম্পর্কে যে গভীর ভালোবাসা, সেই ভালোবাসার যে আবেগটা, সেটা উনি সঞ্চারিত করে দিয়েছিলেন। আজকে একাডেমির নেতৃত্বে যারা আছেন সেই ছাত্রছাত্রীরা তারা বলবেন, আর বন্ধুদের মধ্যে বলার জন্য একমাত্র এই অভাগা আমি রয়ে গেছি। কিন্তু সেই আবেগটা ছড়িয়ে দেবার চেষ্টা আমরা করি। আমার খুব ভালো লাগে যে এখন যারা একাডেমি পরিচালনা করেন তারা একাডেমির যে মূল সেই প্রবণতাটা, সেই আবেগটা, সেটাকে ধরে রেখেছেন এবং ওনারা আরো ভালো করে এই বিভিন্ন বক্তৃতামালার আয়োজন করে, বিশেষ করে একাডেমিক যারা নেতৃত্বে ছিলেন তাদের স্মরণে একটা বক্তৃতামালার ব্যবস্থা করে, আর আধুনিক একটা পাঠ্যক্রমের ব্যবস্থা করে, পরিপূর্ণভাবে পরীক্ষা নিয়ে, ফিল্ড ওয়ার্ক করিয়ে, রিসার্চ করিয়ে তার একটা ডিপ্লোমা কোর্স শেষ করলেন। দুলাল আজকে নেই। উনি যদি থাকতেন, উনি নিজে হয়তো শারীরিকভাবে পেরে উঠতেন না, কিন্তু ওর ছাত্রছাত্রী এবং তাদের সহকর্মীদের এই উদ্দীপনায় তিনি অত্যন্ত খুশি হতেন। এই কথাটা ভেবেই আমার ভালো লাগছে। আশা করব আজকে দুলালের স্মরণে যে আলোচনা চক্র শুরু হলো, আজকে অধ্যাপিকা শিকুল বার্তা তিনি বলতে এসেছেন, তিনি বলবেন, আরো অন্যরাও বলবেন পরের পর। আমি মনে করি এটাই হচ্ছে দুলালকে স্মরণ করা, তার একটা নিছক প্রাতিষ্ঠানিক প্রথাগত স্মরণ সভা না করে এইভাবে স্মরণ করলে হয়তো তাকে বেশি মর্যাদা দেওয়া হবে। সকলকে শুভেচ্ছা জানিয়ে আমি বিদায় নিচ্ছি।
অধ্যাপক সেনগুপ্তকে আমাদের ধন্যবাদ জানাই। সত্যি কথাই দুলাল বাবুরা যখন কাজটা শুরু করেছিলেন, আমরা এতই বয়সে ছোট ছিলাম, স্কুলের একদম গোড়ার দিকে পড়তাম, যে সেই স্মৃতিগুলো আমাদের অনেকেরই আর নেই। কিন্তু এদের কথা মনে না রাখলে আজ একাডেমি অফ ফোকলোর নতুন পর্যায়ে যে কাজটা করছে, সেই কাজটা সঠিকভাবে হতো না, কারণ তাদের দেখানো পথেই আমরা চলেছি। এবারে চলে আসি আমাদের অনুষ্ঠানের মূল পর্বে। একটু বলে নিই যে আমাদের প্রত্যেকবারই যখন একটি করে বক্তৃতামালার আয়োজন করা হয়, কোনো একটি থিম ভাবা হয় এবং সেই থিম ধরে কাজটা করা হয়। তো এবারে যে 6টি বক্তৃতা সাজিয়ে একটি বক্তৃতামালা করা হয়েছে, তার একটি অভিনবত্ব রয়েছে, কারণ আমরা এবারে কিন্তু শুধু বাংলা সাহিত্য নয়, বাংলা সাহিত্যের অঙ্গন থেকে বেরিয়ে গিয়ে বিদেশি সাহিত্য, তার মধ্যে ইংরেজি সাহিত্য রয়েছে, অন্যান্য ভাষা সাহিত্যও থাকবে, এবং বৃহত্তর অর্থে ভারতীয় সাহিত্য যাকে বলে ইন্ডিয়ান লিটারেচার, সেই রকম সাহিত্যকেও আমরা লোক সংস্কৃতির মধ্যে এনে আলোচনা সাজাতে চেয়েছি। আর আরেকটি বৈশিষ্ট্য হচ্ছে যে যে 3টি বর্গের আলোচনা হবে, অর্থাৎ কবিতা, নাটক এবং কথা সাহিত্য, এই বিষয়গুলো নিয়ে যারা বলবেন তারা নিজেরাই কিন্তু কবি বা কথা সাহিত্যিক বা নাট্য অভিনেতা, অর্থাৎ আমরা চেয়েছি যে শুধুমাত্র একাডেমিক বক্তৃতা নয়, যারা নিজেরা কবিতা লিখছেন বা গল্প লিখছেন বা অভিনয় করছেন নাটকে, তারা তাদের আবেগের বা অনুভূতির জায়গাটা যেন আমাদের কাছে তুলে ধরতে পারেন। ফোকলোরকে তারা তাদের নিজেদের রচনার মধ্যে কিভাবে দেখেন সেটাও যেন তাদের লেখার মধ্যে আসে। এবং সেই সূত্রেই it is my pleasure and honor to welcome Dr. Nishi Pulugurta, who is a dear friend, and officially she is the associate professor in English in the very well-known college, Brahmananda Keshab Chandra College. But for us, Nishi is a very, very prolific poet. And on that very note, we had requested her to talk about English poetry and folklore, and she has very graciously accepted our offer. So thank you very much, Nishi, for coming, and you'll be presenting your paper. But before we go into that talk, I would like to give you a very brief note about Dr. Nishi Pulugurta. As I already said, she is a professor of English in Brahmananda Keshab Chandra College, Kolkata. Her areas of interests are British Romantic literature, Indian writing in English, the diaspora, Shakespeare adaptations in film. She has also published in several referred international and national journals, to name a few: Blackwell Publishing, Routledge, etc. Also, she has written in the Cambridge Companion to British Romanticism and Religion. She has a monograph on Derozio and a collection of travel essays out in the open, which I was lucky to read, an edited volume on essays on travel that was. Across and Beyond, she has also written 2 volumes of poems. As I said, that she herself is a poet: The Real and the Unreal and the Other Poems, Raindrops on the Periwinkle, and a collection of short stories, The Windowsill. All these have been published between 2020 and 2022. And she has also co-edited a volume of poems, Voices and Vision, in 2021. She has also edited a special issue of Cafe Dissensus on epidemics, pandemics, and literature, which is also a very, very interesting volume, I must say, and a special feature issue of Muse India on Shakespeare in Indian cinema. And she has edited a volume on essays of literary representation in pandemics, and recently she had a publication from Routledge. So I think when we hear a professor poet talking about English romantic poetry and folklore, it becomes something more than just a lecture, just a compilation of facts. So looking forward to listening from the professor poet, Dr. Nishi Pulugurta. Welcome, Nishi.
Thank you so much. I feel honored and privileged to be here, and I would like to thank everyone at the Academy of Folklore, in particular Professor Pallab Sengupta and Dr. Chandramolli Sengupta, for inviting me to be part of this memorial lecture series. And I really feel this is a great honor. And it's wonderful to know of the work that the Academy of Folklore has been doing. And I must say that Chandramolli's invitation to me made me look up the folklore, though that is not exactly my area of expertise, but since that was what was needed for this talk, so it made me look up, read quite a bit. And I'm really grateful that she did ask me to do that. So what I'm going to talk in this particular talk this evening is I'm going to talk about an area of interest, area where I have worked, which is British Romantic poetry. But I'm going to look at it, I'm going to talk about the various folklore elements that one finds in British Romantic poetry as well. So this is what I'm going to talk about this evening. And after I finish, of course, I mean, I'm more than willing to take questions and comments. I myself, I must say, I have not so much used folklore when I have been writing for the past few years. But one never knows how these things that one studies, one reads, one listens, and one finds out enter into one's work. So I'm hopeful about that as well. So I'm going to concentrate on British Romantic poets. I'll be referring to a few of them, and most of them are very well known. And I begin by referring to the picturesque hills of the English Cumberland area in the 18th century, which were the setting for one of Samuel Taylor Coleridge's very captivating poems called Christabel. Incidentally, Coleridge was the area of my PhD research. So I thought I would begin with Coleridge. And although the action of this story, Christabel, takes place in what looks like a very real and familiar locale, there are several mysterious supernatural qualities, and this particular poem was intended to be a supernatural poem. This is considered to be one of Coleridge's 3 very important supernatural poems. And he brings in these mysterious qualities, which are so very typical of his supernatural poems. However, the boundary between the unreal and the real that Coleridge achieves in this poem is something that one needs to take account of. So he brings in the real through the use of the natural landscape, through the use of the setting. And he brings in the unreal also, the supernatural, through the use of the folklore. By drawing upon the folklore elements, Coleridge is able to access the supernatural world by using common beliefs, superstitions, which at the same time maintain the necessary link with the everyday world. Several years later, when Coleridge was writing about what exactly was his agenda when he was writing the Lyrical Ballads, the volume of poems that he published along with William Wordsworth, he writes that his purpose was to write about poems that would have a lot of the supernatural, but the purpose would be to present this supernatural in such a way that it would seem familiar, it would seem absolutely normal, absolutely natural, as if it is happening everywhere around him. And that is what one sees in this poem as well. And I'll go on to talk about it in a little more detail later on. Folklore elements, these ideas of beliefs, superstitions, a healing remedy, or a manner of action, I think is something that is passed on from one generation to another. And irrespective of age, class, people who are part of that linguistic, who are part of that cultural community, acknowledge that lore, transmit that accumulated knowledge through each succeeding generation. And what passes through folklore becomes part of literature at one point of time. There are these poems that use the folklore, whether it be the folklore elements or the folklore form, have frequent use of repetitions, refrains. The verse that is used has a lot of rhythm, almost so much so that it's a rhythm which is suited to dance. There have been quite a number of poems, ballads, various manuscripts available in the French language from the 13th century, which testify to the fact that songs were sung by the monk, the minstrel, the clerk, even the soldier. And while this is much less seen in English literature, there are still quite a number of Middle English songs available. And one of the interesting things which I find, and which as a practicing poet, I believe very strongly, and I always, even when I'm teaching my students poetry, I tell them to read the poems aloud, because the hearing, what you hear, that aspect of poetry is something very important. You know, poetry is meant to be heard. And I tell them to read the poems aloud, not just when I am doing it, but even when they're studying it at home. And I think it is this reading and reciting of poetry, which has primarily been a traditional oral tradition, has also been a community tradition. And this pattern of poetry being used as a community experience is still seen in several forms. For instance, I'm reminded of the Afghan form of two-line form poems, folk poems, which are called the Landai, which are predominantly recited by women poets. And what's very interesting about the Landai is that the poems are anonymous. So we don't know who wrote the poems, and hence, because they are anonymous, many of them are very subversive. Many of them talk about contemporary events, voice pain, suffering, anger, dissent, protest. And as the women recite the poem, they kind of improvise on the poem. So a Landai, which used to be sung, which used to be recited in the early 20th century, is going to be very different from a Landai which is recited in the 21st century, because as one lives through time, as one reacts to circumstances, to situations, the lines change, the context changes. And what's very interesting about the Landai, I feel, is that they are recited in groups, and hence the shared sense of community. And they are predominantly recited by Afghan women. And so this community kind of a feeling is still very much present. And that, I think, is what is important to note about the folk elements present in poetry as well. So when I talk about folk elements in English poetry, I'm predominantly talking about the romance poem and the ballad. And the ballad has been a very, very popular poem throughout the 16th, 17th, 18th, and later periods as well. And these ballads were sung, and there are various categories of the ballads as well. There are folk ballads, which are also the popular one. There are literary ballads as well. And every ballad tells a story. It's a narrative poem which tells a story. And this is a poem which was meant to be sung. This was meant to be chanted. And in all probability, it is accompanied by some sort of dance and deals with the simple emotions of life, love, hate, the supernatural, talks about tragic feuds, about enmities, about wars, about murders, about love, about being unfaithful in love. And there are also a few which are humorous as well. The poems that I pick and choose for this evening are poems which belong to the British Romantic period. And while it's very difficult to define what the Romantic period is or what Romanticism is, there's no one way in which one could define this particular term. What is interesting about this term is that it comes from it can be traced back to the romances, and it was possibly used to describe anything exotic, anything wonderful. And these poets, whom we today describe as the Romantic poets, when they were writing in the 19th century, in the first quarter of the 19th century, they did not describe themselves as Romantic poets. They had various names. If they were in the Lake District, they were called the Lakeist. Keats was called the Cockney. There were others who were called Scotsmen, and so on. And it was much later, towards the middle of the 19th century, that these poets were gathered together into one term, the English Romantic poets. And the way we use them today dates to about 1940. So Romanticism is something that is a movement that sees literature becoming more emotional, literature having more feeling for nature. There is a greater interest in external nature, a greater interest in man, an interest in the relation between man and God, an interest in the human soul. And what is very interesting from the point of view of this evening's talk is an interest in cultures, remote temporally and spatially. And the interest in the medieval times, the interest in myths, superstitions, beliefs, all of this comes from this interest in cultures, remote temporally and spatially as well. The Romantic poets believe that poetry is one of the best ways of expression, not that they were not using other forms of writing as well, they were. But poetry to them was something which was the most important genre, and the truths of poetry, they believe, could be expressed using the special powers of imagination. And it is because of this emphasis on imagination that one notices a fascination with dreams, with supernatural phenomena, with the medieval romances, with stories with supernatural incidents, stories with supernatural characters, and so on. The ballad that became an interesting form, which was used in the Romantic period, when it begins, the poem, a ballad poem begins with the action immediately. There is no introduction, absolutely. You kind of plunge into the action of the poem. The 18th century poet Thomas Gray was someone who was very much interested in the ballad, and he says in one place that the ballad is you kind of plunge into the middle of the action of the ballad, and then slowly you understand what the story is all about. A ballad was often written to be sung, to be read aloud, and to create a sense of suspense among the original listeners. And because this sense of suspense is something very important in a ballad, therefore there is this sense of vividness. And there is a lot of dialogue in a ballad as well. And the language of the ballad is very simply, very homely. At times, the poet would be using dialect. In fact, the finest English ballads are almost invariably in the language of the Scottish borders. And it was something, the stories were something that would appeal to ordinary people. There would be a lot of stock expressions, colloquial expressions, which readers, which listeners would immediately be able to identify, would be able to understand. The comparisons used in the poem and the ballad would be something very, very simple. And, threes and sevens and are very important numbers in the ballad. So people would be absent for 3 years or for 7 years. Most of the primitive ballads have stanzas of 2 lines. And very frequently, as I said, they're in the form of a question and an answer. The standard ballad measure has a stanza which consists of 4 lines, of which the first and the third have 8 syllables, and the second and the fourth have 6 syllables. Only the second and the fourth lines rhymes, right? And one does not. The other thing to remember is that in spite of the fact that there is rhyme and rhythm, one needs to remember that the rhythm and the rhyme in a folk ballad is not always perfect. The rhythm comes in the poem also by use of a refrain, which may consist of 2 or 3 words, maybe, or of 1 or 2 lines, which are repeated almost every other stanza. Some of the simplest ballads, some of the ballads, most popular ones, show the use of the supernatural, where you see 2 lovers separated in life by family feuds, who are buried in the same churchyard, and you have a rose bush growing over each grave, one with red rose and one with white rose. And these 2 rose bushes intertwine above the 2 graves. We also have a group of ballads in which the ghost of the dead lover comes back to haunt the faithless loved one who, in the absence of the lover, has married another. There are also several ballads in which this person who comes in a ghost form is not really the lover, the dead lover, but a devil disguised in that shape. These poems were written, they are based on stories that common people in England knew, and they were written by common people, and they were not, as I said, not perfect rhyme and perfect rhythm. Everyone in the audience knew the story that was to be sung. Therefore, the work of the poet was not to give a lengthy introduction or numerous details, but to keep his audience enraptured for as long as possible. The initial ballads were not written down, but they were passed from mouth to mouth, oral transmission from generation to generation. And as this oral transmission happened, changes would be introduced into a text of a ballad, depending upon the circumstance that a person who's reciting in it is, or what affects that person. And there could be ballads with several versions differing from one another, in a little way or in a drastic way as well. So there are these several ballads, most of them extant English and Scottish ballads, which date from the 15th century and later. And they have been later on collated and collected in volumes of poems, in volumes, which become very important, because by the time the British Romantics begin to write, this volume, which brings together several of these ballads, are available. Even earlier, somebody like Philip Sidney, who was writing in the 16th century, speaks of the ballad. And even in the 18th century, the English essayist Joseph Addison writes in one of his essays about the pleasure of the ballads. But it was the pre-Romantic poets, Thomas Gray, Robert Burns, and William Blake, and the Romantic poets who drew the attention of the literary world to the ballad. One of the most important reasons for this, of course, is that during this time there was Bishop Percy, who discovered an old manuscript which contained ballads, and Percy edits this volume, rewrote some of them, and published this volume. This particular work is called Relics of Ancient English Poetry. It's just referred to as Percy's Relics of Ancient English Poetry. And this particular volume had an immense influence on British Romantic poetry, so much so that almost every Romantic poet, wrote poems which in some way or the other bring in folklore elements in their poems. 1798 is a very important date for British Romanticism, a very thin volume of poems called the Lyrical Ballads. And I think what's important to note is the title of the volume as well. It's called the Lyrical Ballads. Was published in 1798. The first edition of this volume had only 23 poems, out of which 19 were by William Wordsworth and 4 were by Samuel Taylor Coleridge. So this is the coming together of two major poets of the time. And this particular work, the Lyrical Ballads, kind of brings to the forefront a new kind of writing poetry. Of the poems, of the several poems in this, of the 23 poems that are there in this volume, at least about 11 or 12 are actually ballads. Later on, in the second edition, which was published in 1800, many more other poems were also added to this volume, and several people are aware of the poems here. We have Tintern Abbey, we have the Lucy poems by Wordsworth, and of course, we have Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, which was in this volume as well. So I think the title, the reference to the ballads in the very name is something which is very important and which shows that this particular form of poetry was very, very important at this point of time. Wordsworth evidently expected his readers to find ballads very, very attractive, very interesting. And it was almost as if, ballads were in vogue, ballads were in fashion at this point of time. And it's almost as if Wordsworth and Coleridge were just responding to what was so very interesting and so very important at this point of time. At the beginning of the 19th century, another writer, Sir Walter Scott, who's also a very important novelist and a poet as well, who publishes a collection which is called Minstrelsy of the Scottish Border. And I think any talk which talks about Walter Scott and the Romantic period would obviously speak about the influence of the folk ballad in his work, which was so very popular at this point of time. I think Wordsworth's simple poems, Coleridge's Rime of the Ancient Mariner, or Keats's La Belle Dame Sans Merci would not have been written but for the rediscovery of the folk ballad in the 18th century. Apart from Bishop Percy's work, which I referred to, there is another work that one needs to speak about when one is talking about the resurrection of the folk forms in the 18th century, and that is James Macpherson's Fragments of Ancient Poetry collected in the Highlands of Scotland. These poems, this work of James Macpherson, along with Percy's Relics of Ancient English Poetry, are very, very important when one is talking about English Romantic poetry and folklore. The medieval past was a world that held innumerable prospects. It was a world of wonder and mystery for these Romantic poets. One also needs to remember this is the time that where one sees the Gothic novel, which is a novel which brings in the atmosphere of the supernatural, the horror, suspense, through the use of medieval settings, through the use of a variety of supernatural characters and effects. Traditional beliefs, superstitions, legends, all of these were employed to intensify the terror, to intensify the horror of stories stories that are seen in these Gothic novels. For instance, Horace Walpole's Castle of Otranto or Matthew Gregory Lewis's The Monk. The world of the folklore that one finds in British Romantic poetry is a world that presents a simplicity of culture that is uncorrupted by a sophisticated society. It was a very simple, ordinary world the world of people who were untutored, who mostly belong to the rural setup. And this is the world where beliefs, superstitions, customs, but also different ways in which language could be used, different forms of verse could be used. And this is seen, for instance, in a poem by Robert Burns called Tam O'Shanter. And Tam O'Shanter is a very long poem in which Robert Burns presents a vivid picture of the drinking classes in the old Scottish town of Ayr in the late 18th century. And there are several unforgettable characters in this poem. And, the tale also introduces humor, pathos, horror, and social comment. The poem talks about the habits of Tam, a farmer who often gets drunk, and in his thoughtless ways, he's very thoughtless towards his wife, who is waiting for him at home. One night, after all this drinking is over, after a market day, Tam rides home on his horse while there is a storm brewing. And on the way, he sees a local church, a local haunted church, which is lit up brightly with witches and warlocks dancing and the devil playing bagpipes. He's still drunk, and he's amazed to see the place bedecked with such strange creatures. The witches are dancing as the music intensifies, and upon seeing Tam, they shout out to him. Immediately, the lights go out. When the witches notice a human being, the music and dance stops, and many of the creatures run after Tam while the witches are leading them. That is when Tam, rushes forth. He rides forth on his horse and continues till he reaches home. So that's the story that is spoken about in this particular poem. The British Romantic poets wanted to write about the unusual. As I mentioned earlier on, they were interested in remote geographical places. They were more interested in the cultures of the past. And one of the reasons for this, of course, is that they could bring in these legends and superstitions, ancient religions and mythology, which they found very, very interesting. And all these are seen in, say, for instance, the stories of Oriental legends and tales, which is seen in Thomas More's Lalla Rookh. We have Sir Walter Scott, who contributed largely to the revival of the ballad, The Lady of the Lake, and poems like William and Helen. We have Lord Byron, who also used this supernatural legendary material in his poem Prisoner of Chillon, and in Manfred, which is a dramatic poem written in the Gothic tradition. One notices several examples of folk belief, of superstition being used. Folk mythology also provided Shelley with material for many of his poems, whether it be Prometheus Unbound or Adonis, whether it be poems like Hymn to Apollo, Hymn to Pan. Even Queen Mab, brings in references to fairy lore, to folklore. Keats, of course, drew on folk mythology for his Lamia. He spoke about customs, beliefs in the Eve of St. Agnes and La Belle Dame Sans Mercy. When Wordsworth was writing, even before the lyrical ballads, and when he came in contact with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, and they kind of began to collaborate on this work, he does mention in the preface to the second edition of the lyrical ballads, the preface was written by Wordsworth in 1800. And there he mentions that one of the reasons as to why they are producing this collection is because they want to use the language that is used by common people. They want to talk about customs, ways of life of common people, so that one could be true to the nature of man. And this, when he's writing about all of this, he is largely focusing upon the lives of ordinary people, upon superstitions, beliefs, and various legends that he find among the folk for the creation of poems like Michael, Goody Blake, and Harry Gill, and Lucy Gray. It's also the place where they were living at that point of time, the Lake District, inspired several poets of the Romantic age. Wordsworth in particular found inspiration to write some of his most memorable lines while he was walking all across this wonderful landscape of the Lake District. One poem by Wordsworth called The Somnambulist, which I would like to refer, talks about this world. And this poem is about a story about the legend of Lady Emma and Sir Eglamour, which talks about a bold and noble knight named Sir Eglamour who was betrothed to the beautiful Lady Emma. And though he loved her, he was very much the knight errant, and often he had to travel to far off lands to fight. And although the couple was truly in love, Sir Eglamour increasingly spent more and more time away from the lady, and poor Lady Emma began to miss him, and as a result of which her health and sleep became affected. She began to walk in her sleep, and in her sleep, she began to walk around in various places. She was found walking at night, and one night, when she walks about in her sleep, she goes to their very favorite place where they often met, and this was the waterfall of Ira Force, which is there in the Lake District, and where she stood on the edge of the ravine. And as it happened, she falls down, right? And this gentleman, when he comes back, he thinks he sees her standing there, and when he goes and touches her, he notices that she suddenly kind of vanishes almost. And Wordsworth writes about this particular moment in the poem called The Somnambulist. So he uses this story of Sir Eglamour in this particular poem called The Somnambulist. And the very title talks about Lady Emma and her habit of walking about in her sleep. And this is these are the lines. Soul shattered was the night, nor knew if Emma's ghost it were, or boding shade, or if the maid, her very self, stood there. He touched what followed, who shall tell? The soft touch snapped the thread. Of slumber shrieking back she fell, and the stream whirled her down the dell, along its foaming bed. So Wordsworth tells the story in this poem, but there is a debate among scholars. Several scholars believe that this particular story was something that was common at that point of time, and Wordsworth uses that story in his poem. Of course, there are some who believe that Wordsworth actually creates the myth of this story and uses it. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, of course, used several traditions of the folk in his poetry. His use of the ballad, which is a very ancient form of folk song, as we all know, is seen wonderfully in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner. It's also seen in another poem called The Ballad of the Dark Lady. And these are poems which involve the supernatural, which involve the world of the spirits. As does Kubla Khan as well, which is filled with references from ancient religions of the East and the West. Christabel, which I referred to right at the beginning, along with the Rime of the Ancient Mariner and the Ballad of the Dark Lady, was begun in preparation when Coleridge began to work for the lyrical ballads. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner is a very long poem. It's a delightful poem, and a delightful poem to be read aloud as well. And incidentally, during the pandemic, there had been several people, several actors and several poets reading the poem aloud. It's wonderful to be able to listen to the way in which the poem moves ahead. And the poem describes a ship being trapped in ice at the South Pole, and after it escapes, the sailors credit their salvation to an albatross. However, the ancient mariner shoots the bird with the crossbow, and the misfortunes follow. Several misfortunes follow. He's blamed by his shipmates, who hang the dead body of the bird around his neck. And he says, instead of the cross, the albatross about my neck was hung. Gradually, there are a series of events which happen because of this one deed which the ancient mariner does. And over a period of time, when the ancient mariner becomes more and more aware to the natural world around him, there is a redemption that happens. But the story, in spite of the redemption, in spite of the penance that he has at the end, in spite of the moral at the story, the ancient mariner is forced to tell his story. So there will be moments where he will have to get hold of someone. He could choose anyone at random and tell his story. And this telling and retelling of the story is something that always reminds me of the ballad form of these folk tales, which one keeps on telling, and as every telling, every retelling endows these stories with a different meaning, with a different connotation. A story told over and over again at various times in various places kind of endows the story with a different connotation altogether. The Rime of the Ancient Mariner is a poem in 7 parts. Right, it's a pretty long poem, but it is a poem that brings in several elements of the folk, and there's been a lot of work done to critically analyze the various kinds of influences that one notices, in the poem, the kind of various kinds of influences that that helped Coleridge, that influenced Coleridge to write this particular poem. There are lines where several things are repeated, several lines are repeated. There are lines in the poem where one finds a lot of alliteration. And these are some of the very famous lines in the poem. Water, water everywhere, and all the boats did shrink. Water, water everywhere, nor any drop to drink. And there's another one where you'll see a lot of alliteration. And this figure of speech helps in a lot of rhythm as well. And the lines go, the fair breeze blew, the white foam flew, the furrowed followed free. We were the first that ever burst into that silent sea. So he repeats, and what is very interesting in the Rime of the Ancient Mariner is that it has a melody. And the melody in the lines that I just read right now, it's wonderful to hear the melody. And the poem talks about how the ancient mariner ship, sails past the equator, is driven by storms to the cold regions towards the South Pole. And from the South Pole, how the ship sails back through the Pacific, of the killing of the albatross and of the several other events which happen because of that. At its very simple level, the Rime of the Ancient Mariner is also a tale of crime, punishment, and redemption. And by learning to love, however, the Ancient Mariner partially redeems himself, but then his penance consists of further wanderings. And as I said, as he wanders further, he needs to tell and retell the story. And it is this retelling that's something that adds to the magic of the poem as well. There's another poem by Coleridge which I would like to refer here to show how he uses a very simple belief that was there present very commonly at this point of time. This is a poem called Frosted Midnight, and this is a poem which is referred to as a conversation poem. And the poem begins like all other conversation poems. They are meditative poems in blank verse. And the poet is all alone, separated from nature and society. Outside, the frost is at its work, and inside the house there's the fire burning, and the speaker and the poet is sitting with his small child beside him who is sleeping. And as he looks at the fire burning on the grate, he sees something jumping. Right, a film of ash jumping on the fireplace, on the grate. And he says, but oh, how oft at school, with most believing mind, presageful, have I gazed upon the bars to watch that fluttering stranger. This stranger that he describes is actually the film of ash which is flapping on the grate. And there was a folkloric belief at this point of time. And this film of ash was referred to as a stranger. And whenever a stranger would be flapping on the grate, it was said to foretell the arrival of an unexpected guest. And here in this poem, which is a meditation on life, on his past life, on his family, on the world around him, he brings in this element, just one small element, but it adds so much to the meaning of the poem. The poem moves out of this small little room where he is. It goes back to his childhood. And when it comes back again, when the poem ends, he has a much heightened realization of himself and the world around him. Coleridge's Christabel, which is a very long poem once again, is a poem where he uses English meter, the kind of meter used in folklore. And this is a poem which has a lot of elements of feudal England. And in this poem, Christabel, the central character of the poem, is praying beneath an old oak tree. And this oak tree is outside the castle, and there she sees a woman who claims to have escaped bandits. And Christabel offers to help the woman. And as she helps the woman, who's called Geraldine, and she brings Geraldine into the castle, there are several strange things happening, which kind of tell the reader that Geraldine is not good, that there is something wrong about Geraldine, that Geraldine is a kind of a witch or a kind of a lamia kind of a creature. And this is how I'll just read a few lines from the poem. Beneath the lamp, the lady bowed and slowly rolled her eyes around. Then, drawing in her breath aloud, like one that shuddered, she unbound the cincture from beneath her breast, her silken robe and inner vest dropped to her feet and full in view. Behold, her bosom and full and half her side, a sight to dream of, not to tell. Oh, shield her, shield sweet Christabel. So, what does Christabel see? What is this danger? This is not told to us, but we do realize that there's something terrible that's happening, and what's going to happen to Christabel. One can only guess as to what is going to happen to Christabel, because Coleridge never finished the poem. The poem is in 2 parts, and he had planned to write 3 parts to the poem. However, he leaves it incomplete. So it is nevertheless an interesting poem, and a poem which could be a morality tale, a poem which could talk about good and evil, a poem which brings in various psychological aspects to it, and a poem which brings in several elements of supernatural, several elements of the folk into this particular world. The influence of these old ballads, Percy's Relics, is a very strong influence on Coleridge's work. Is seen through the way in which he uses meter, the word choice. For instance, the Ancient Mariner, the spelling of the Ancient Mariner, the various expressions that are used in the poem are something which traces their origin back to these collected volumes which Percy brought together, where he brings all these various old stories into one volume. The moon, for instance, figures very importantly in many of these poems which Coleridge writes, and the moon is a powerful image which evokes the power and unpredictability of nature. It serves as a kind of omen. And there is another poem by Coleridge, which is called Dejection and Ode, a poem that Coleridge revised several times. And this poem has a small epigraph. And the epigraph to this poem actually is taken from the Ballad of Sir Patrick Spens. So he takes these first 4 lines from the Ballad of Sir Patrick Spens, which at this point of time was a very popular ballad and is possibly of Scottish origin. It is a ballad which talks about disaster at sea, and it is one of the most anthologized of British ballads. And Coleridge's poem Dejection and Ode begins with an epigraph from this ballad, which says, late yestreen, I saw the new moon with the old moon in her arms, and I fear, my master dear, we shall have a deadly storm. And when Coleridge begins writing his poem Dejection and Ode, he refers to the grand old ballad of Sir Patrick Spens right in the 2nd line of the poem. And that shows how important this particular ballad was, and how Coleridge had already read all of these poems. And when he himself went back to writing, he wrote about all of them in his work, because they are important in order to understand what he's trying to, in order to understand his theme and his purpose in writing the poems as well. Keats also uses several of these elements from the folk in his poetry. He is another poet who is very much interested in the medieval world, and he refers to several of them. For instance, La Belle Dame Sans Merci takes the title from the courtly love tradition. And he, very much like Christabel, the story is of a woman whose where and the story is of one where there is a fear of a life devouring seductress. And this is something which is present in the English folk tradition as well, this vampire-like kind of person. Keats used the stories of medieval romances to form the themes of poems which vividly recall the life of the Middle Ages. And as I referred to some of them earlier on, The Eve of St. Agnes, the fragment, The Eve of St. Mark, Isabella, all of them create, in all of these poems, Keats creates a sense of weirdness, a sense of enchantment. He creates a sense of supernatural wonder. And he does make a little bit of changes, because the knights that he presents in his poems are not ruthless warriors, but they are very gentle kind of knights. Endymion is a medieval lover he presents, and Keats uses a lot of music in Endymion, in Hyperion, in Lamia. He uses a lot of spells, right? He describes Lamia as having druid locks, and there is this note of pensiveness pervading in almost all of Keats's verse, which also suggests medieval emotionalism. Keats also, apart from using the ballad, he used several other verse patterns as well. For instance, the sonnet, the ballad stanzas, the Spenserian stanzas, the couplet, and the enjambment lines leading on from one to another as well. There are several examples, several more examples that one could give, but I would like to talk about a woman poet, Felicia Hemans, who was also writing at the same point of time, who writes this poem called Taliesin's Prophecy, which brings in several aspects of Welsh legends and Welsh folk history. And she's doing this to evoke a sense of the past. And this is how the poem reads: A voice from time departed yet floats thy hills among. O Cambria, thus thy prophet bard, thy Taliesin sung. The path of unborn ages is traced upon my soul. The clouds which mantle things unseen, away before me roll. Felicia Hemans, a very important poet writing at this point of time, also wrote poems where she engaged with Scottish folklore, with history and nationalism. Her poem Valice's invocation to Bruce, what she does is that she romanticizes and mythologizes Scotland's war with Edward I of England. And here, this poem is a wonderful example of popular national sentiment, whereby a poet is using history. And Wallace's invocation to Bruce is also a highly romantic poet, replete with natural imagery shrouded in mists and prophetic visions of what might happen in the future. And I'll just read a few lines from the poem. Those visions o'er my thought have passed, where mountain vapors darkly roll. That spirit had possessed my soul, and shadowy forms have met mine eye. The beings of futurity, and a deep voice of years to be hath told that Scotland shall be free. So a poem that talks about nature, a poem that also talks about nationalism. And it is evident from Felicia Hemans' Welsh and Scottish themed poetry that she was very much interested in national past and ideas about nationhood. Indeed, the growth of popular national identity is often regarded as concurrent with the development of Romanticism. And in the women poets and their contribution to the development of Romantic poetry has been a much recent phenomena. Earlier on, the canon was predominantly male. So I just would like to come to the end of my talk by talking about how the several motives of the Lamia, of the vampire, of the serpent damsel, used in Romantic poetry later on find their ways into other poems as well, other poetry, later poets as well. The influence of several ballads from Percy's Relics and of some of the Gothic romances that were extremely popular at this point of time is something that is seen in the Romantic poet. And many of the parallel elements appearing in these works are common ones to Romantic tales. And all have similar scenic backgrounds with conventional characters and include romantic aspects of the medieval past. The use of folklore elements thus become a means whereby poets can achieve their ultimate goal in the larger action of the poem. So Felicia Hemans using Welsh and Scottish folk material to talk about nationalism. And several of these poets were using these elements to establish the necessary mood and atmosphere and to develop the supernatural characters introduced into this setting. Several of these poems are extremely popular, extremely well known, and reading them is always has a charm of its own. Thank you. So that brings me to the end. I hope I have not spoken too much.
Absolutely
Nice.
not. And I must say that it was a very, very engrossing session for not just myself and for all of the people who are listening to this your talk in the Facebook page. And you have questions also, which I'll be sharing with you right after I speak a little. Actually, what I really liked about the talk is that, you've spoken about the poets whom we all know, like Shelley, Keats, Wordsworth, Coleridge. Even if we have studied Bengali literature, but we are very familiar with these poets, English poets. But what is most interesting is that you can read a poem just as a poem, and you can read a poem from a particular angle. In your talk today, probably the most interesting part was that you have chosen to locate and share those particular angles which have dealt with or which are connected with folklore. And myself being a student of folklore, I found certain very interesting similarities that we talk about when we talk about pure folklore. Like, I would just like to mention a few. You have mentioned about community experience. Yes, anything which a folk literature has started actually as a community experience, because everything was shared, and that is the reason we do not find the name of the poet or the name of the author who has first written it, because it is always anonymous. And on that context, you have mentioned the Landai, where again you have said about the improvisation, which is also, it is always oral tradition with time, and the poem passes on from one generation to the other. So it being the oral tradition, naturally inputs start coming in, and it gets very difficult later at the later stage to find out what was the original version of the particular poem. And the way you have analyzed poems, of particular poets, Ancient Mariner, all these poems, we all know these poems, but the way you have mentioned it, that has also been very interesting. And for myself, the very important and very interesting part was when you were actually talking about the influence that ballads have on letter poetries or the romantic poetries, how the romantic poets have not only drew attention to the ballads, but also drew inspiration from the ballads. Because when you were talking, I was listening to your rendition, or they have actually written ballads. They have actually stuck to the past and created their own ballads in the modern times. And one interesting point I noted is that you said that all the romantic poets, whatever they've written, they always their writings always contain some folklore element, which is being a folklorist myself, it's very interesting that romantics have come together like this. And the incorporation of supernatural, incorporation of the legends, the myths in the romantic poetry does give us an insight, a different insight into the romantic poems. Because yes, when we read romantic poems, we read from one particular angle, but we do not think about these folklore elements that are already there in the romantic poetry. So that has actually come out from your talk, and that has been very, very illuminating for many of us. You have mentioned about Shelley's poems, you mentioned about Keats' poems, you have mentioned about Wordsworth, and very interestingly that you have talked about the influence the Lake District has had on Wordsworth poems. And definitely a non-city atmosphere does give you some impetus, probably does give you some kind of inspiration. The landscape sometimes might give you not only just a romantic feeling, but maybe a connection to the rurality, to the village around you, to write you poems. And regarding Coleridge, Rhyme of the Ancient Mariner happens to be also a very favorite poem of mine. I really loved that part when you were saying that the mariner was traveling and therefore he was retelling this story So this is also a very important aspect of folklore, that whenever a person is retelling a story, even if one single person, even in Bengali ballads we have, even in Bengali Gitika, the ones we call Gitika, and the Gitika we also have the same things, or the Mongol Kabus we have the same thing, Vaishnava Padabalis we have the same thing. Like when one person is passing on the whatever he is oral tradition to the other person, there becomes a change. And even a bard, when he goes from one place to another, he generally incorporates the language or some kind of speciality from the place where he was going, or from the people whom he's talking to. So this is a very interesting point which I didn't know before, that the ancient mariner was retelling the story, and the retelling of the story is definitely very, very important folk element. And I must say that mentioning Felicia Hemans is extremely important, because we as women, as Professor Sengupta was saying, I know a few of my friends, folklorists, who are not, unlike me, they are practicing folklorists, who go for field service and stuff like that. They do face lots of troubles, and yeah, men do have an edge while going to the fields and getting information or getting data, and then writing folklore or doing research in folklore. So when we get to know about a person like Felicia Hemans, who's a very contemporary lady, I don't like saying poetess, a lady poet or a female poet, it is very interesting, and it is very heartening and encouraging also to know that even now in modern times, women poets are coming up, and they are using Welsh folk stories, and they're evoking the past through Scottish folklores, and that is the way they're trying to give a dimension of the nationalism, or they're trying to show their connection with the nation. So these are the points which really, really touched me a lot, and I really loved your lecture. But now is the time for two questions, which we have received from the people who have been listening to your lecture. One has come from Dr. Deptushi Mishra Chaudhary. She wanted to know the usage of fairy tales in romantic poetry, and what are the aspects of the usage of fairy tales in romantic poetry. I mean, does romantic poetry incorporate fairy tales? I mean, I think that is the question she possibly wanted to know. So that is the first question. And the second question came from Madam Shujata Roy, who asked the question, what is the difference, or how would you differentiate between romanticism and folklore? These are the two questions which have come for you.
Yeah, I have not so much come across fairy tales. I think fairy tales is a much later phenomena, I assume. I'm not someone who's an expert on this, but I mean, I must thank you for actually asking me to come, because of which I started exploring the folklore aspects. And then I found that, we have spoken about, I had spoken about all of this. I knew about all of this, but I had not spoken about it differently as a folklore element. And that is something which, came to my mind. So I have not so much come across folklore elements, but yes, there have been several superstitions, legends, folk tales, vampire stories about this serpent kind of damsel, but folk I have not so much come across.
Not even fairy tales. I mean, that's what she wanted to possibly know. Is there any
fairy tales?
No fairy tales? Yeah, no fairy tales. Okay.
I have not encountered the fairy tale reference. I may have missed. I'm not sure. But now that someone has pointed it out, maybe I'll go back to have a look whether there are any fairy tale elements which I have not been able to see. And the other difference between the folklore and the romantic, when I'm saying the word romantic, I have a capital R for romantic. This romantic has nothing to do with love. This romantic refers to a particular group of poets and writers who were writing more or less in this particular point of time, from the, say, 1770s onward till 1830s or 1835. And the reason we call them romantics is there's no specific reason why they're called romantics, but they grouped together in one particular form because there are certain characteristic features that one sees in their works, and that is one is a great importance laid on nature, a great importance laid on human beings, great importance laid on the idea of imagination, great importance laid on the older times, the medieval period, the older period, and where the poet is talking about, the poet, as Wordsworth says, is a man speaking to men. I mean, in today's world, we could always change. The poetry is about ordinary people, simple people, their lives, and there are certain characteristic features in these poems which make them, which is the reason why they are grouped together as romantic poets. So this has got nothing to do with romance as in love. This is a capital R, just called the romantic poets. They're called romanticism because these poets spoke about spontaneity. They spoke about organicism. That is, it's like a seed being planted and the plant coming up. So the poem is supposed to be an organic whole. And one of the important things in their poetry is the importance that they gave to imagination, which is why there is so much of the wild, so much of the supernatural, the vampires. And it's because of that, possibly, that even Mary Shelley was able to come up at this point of time, almost around this point. Even she belongs to the same period, to create this monster in her novel Frankenstein, because Frankenstein also does have elements of the Gothic in it. So had it not been for this influence of the older world, maybe even Frankenstein brings together a lot of myth and lot of it's not exactly a vampire tale, but there are several elements of the Gothic in Frankenstein as well. So that is what the Romantic period is about. So there are specific characteristics in the Romantic period, and that's the reason why they're grouped together. Right. And there are not just male poets, there are several women poets. And actually, the women poets were more popular at the time that they were writing. Felicia Hemans, Mrs. Robinson was much more popular than Wordsworth or even Coleridge. However, it was only a male poet who could become a poet laureate, which is why Wordsworth becomes a poet laureate. But if you read poems, if you read contemporary accounts, the women poets were very, very popular. And I make it a point to bring in a reference to at least one woman poet, because that's what the romantic canon is. It's not just Wordsworth, Coleridge, Keats, Shelley. So there is much more to it, varied kinds of poems as well.
Because we do have a very constricted idea of romantic poetry always being associated with Keats and Shelley and Wordsworth and Coleridge. So it is interesting that you have mentioned at least one woman and another two poets. And I think Dr. Depti Mishra Chaudhary and Madam Sujata Rai, I think we've got your answers, because during the course of a talk, Dr. Kodagutta has been several times mentioning that, the romantic poetries do contain legends, myths, they contain folk mythology, they contain customs, common beliefs, and they talk about ordinary people. So I think that actually explains why romanticism or the romantic poets and folklore can be tied together. And we are happy that we had chosen this topic, and Dr. Kodagutta had also agreed to talk on this. So this gives us actually a very different angle, or a very different dimension, or a very different way of looking at the romantic poetry. Much different from how we have been trying to do it so far.
I was just thinking about Walter Scott, and when we're talking about Walter Scott, he's someone who kind of brought Scotland, who made Scotland very popular, when he spoke about Scottish history and Scottish legends, and later on, Scotland became a very important tourist place as well. So he had a very major role in bringing these Scottish legends and these stories into his work, and he was an extremely popular writer as well. And later on, Queen Victoria loved reading Scott, and it is because of her love of Walter Scott that she visited Scotland and kind of brought Scotland, as a major
spot.
It's another interesting bit.
Definitely. So on behalf of Academy of Folklore, Nishi, I wish to thank you from the bottom of my heart for this very, very enriching and wonderful lecture, and really looking forward to hearing you later on also. It has been a pleasure, 1.5 hours for you. Good night.
Thank you so much. Good night.
Bye.